Welcome everybody to the fourth in our series of virtual Wednesday evenings at the British Institute of Florence. Our speaker tonight, Alan Pascuzzi, is a very well-known artist and teacher who's been resident in Florence for a long time. He's a practicing artist of traditional techniques of the Renaissance, as well as an accomplished historian of that period. So I'm going to hand it over to Alan, ask him to deliver his lecture now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I appreciate it. This is an honor and also a great experience. Let's get right into the talk. The talk that I'm going to be giving tonight, is called Art in the Domestic Sphere. There's going to be four essential sections. The first is a very brief introduction, art for the city, art for the home. The second section is a very brief background on wealth, plague, and family in the early Renaissance. And then the third section is the importance of the palazzo as an entity in itself. The last section are the stages of life in art. And I'll be dealing with marriage, childbirth and death, and I'll be looking at the types of art that were associated with those life events. And let's go right in. What are the general objectives of the talk? The way I've approached this is a very broad observation of Renaissance art in Florence. So architecture, painting, sculpture. So I'll be going basically to all four corners of the city. So it's a very broad sort of a look. The second thing is I'm going to be exploring the human dimension of art objects, which are often overlooked in the museum environment. So I'll be referring to the museum, but what I want to do is bring it back to the human sort of emotion and experience. And then the third, very tentatively, is construct some general conclusions on Renaissance society as interpreted from the object. So those are sort of the main objectives. What's the macrocosm of all this? The first thing is Renaissance art in the public sphere. And I start off with Santa Maria Novella that left in the high altar of the Tornabuoni Chapel in the church itself. And this is a sacred art for ecclesiastical spaces. So it's very public, everyone can see. We also have art for the city like Or San Michele. If you walk down Via Calzaioli, you're going to see one of the tallest buildings right in the center. And all of the various sculptures. So on the right, you see Nani di Banco, the four crowned martyrs. And that's a very civic, very guild-orientated sort of art. But we have another type of art, which has always fascinated me. And even as an artist as well, I've noticed that sometimes it's the art for the home that actually hits a little deeper. And that's art for the home. And it's associated with the stages of life. And what do I mean by this? It's the domestic sphere. It's the family and social status that has to be dealt with. Marriage, childbirth, and also death. And what I have here is an image of the interior of the Palazzo Davanzati, one of the Sala Madornale. And this is what I'm going to be focusing on. Now, what do I mean? When I mean the status, I mean something like a Palazzo Davanzati, this big palace, which I'll be referring to in just a moment, in Via Porta Rossa. Or if you're in the Uffizi and you're walking through and you see various paintings, this is of Raphael's Maddalena Strozzi and Michelangelo's Donitondo. There are stories behind this. There are human stories that in a museum setting sometimes are lost. And then we have the Bargello Museum. And if you go up into the upper floors and you see all of these wonderful portraits of individuals, well, there's stories behind these portraits. Or in the distance, you can see some of these Madonnas, painted Madonnas. What were they for? What were the human connections? Not the art historical or just the stylistic. What were the human stories behind these? And then finally, the Bardini Museum with that wall of Madonnas, okay, that wonderful sort of room. And then you have down below, underneath the crucifix, all of those cassonis, these chests, okay, put together. They're sort of isolated, but these all have stories, family stories behind them. And this is what I want to extract from all this. So what I'm going to be dealing with are painted chests, dishes, sculptures, and portraits. And this is the bread and butter of Renaissance art. As an artist, this is how many artists actually made their living in certain cases. And let's get right into this. Section 2. Some background on wealth, plague, and family in the early Renaissance. And I have this image of Florence in front of you, this wonderful drawing where you see the whole city in the city walls, okay, the civitas, okay, everything right together. This is the city of Florence, so that civic spirit. And if you look at what was happening in Florence, let's jump right into the 1200s. Between 1270 and 1280, there was a, if I could use this terminology, economic boom. The rise of Florentine banking houses, trade with all of Europe, even beyond that. Remember, after Marco Polo, they had favors granted to them by the King of France. The merchant guilds were strong. In fact, it established the whole government with the merchant guilds. There was no more aristocracy that was controlling it. And Florence really had a commercial hold and political domination of Tuscany. And we have the growth of these very wealthy families. Now, well, let's go from the macrocosm to a little bit towards the microcosm. Wealth had it still does today, a big part of Florentine society. San Bernardino, who's writing in the early 1400s, actually makes a commentary on wealth. And he says, to be rich in itself, okay, forgive the spelling, is not evil. It is only evil to the extent that riches are used badly. In themselves, riches are good, but the problem lies when they are acquired evilly or used evilly. Riches, which have been well earned and well used, are a great grace of God. And that rings true. So this is one side of wealth. But what was the other side of wealth? Then we have to go to Dante, and we go to Inferno, Canto 17, when he's in the realm of the usurers. And let me just read this to you, because he's talking about one of the greatest usurers of the day. Then we descended on the right and made 10 paces toward the edge. Then we might quite avoid the sand and flames. I saw upon the sand, a little farther upwards, people sitting near the empty space. Through the eyes their grief was bursting forth, that from the neck of each there hung a pouch which had a certain color and uncertain impress, and one who, with a sow azure and pregnant, had his argent sacklet stamped, said to me, what art thou doing in this pit? And he meets Rinaldo Scrovegni, extremely wealthy individual from Padua, and essentially he's put him in the lowest rungs of hell, which struck a chord to all these very wealthy people. In fact, at left I even have Enrico Scrovegni, who's offering the Scrovegni chapel as expiating, to expiate the sins of his father. In fact, if anyone's been to Padua and you see the Scrovegni chapel, you can realize how great they felt they were sinners, because the chapel is filled with these amazing frescoes by Giotto, a lot of money. So what were these families trying to do? The wealthy banking families in Florence were seeking means to expiate their sins for the hope of salvation. They were allying themselves with Franciscan and Dominican, donating funds for chapels like the High Altar of Santa Croce. So the Bardi, Peruzzi, Baroncelli, who were lending money at sometimes 20 to 30% interest, okay, which were usurers, through faith, politics, money, propaganda, whatever, the chapels that they were trying to decorate, like in Santa Croce, the Bardi and Peruzzi chapels, were basically trying to expiate their sins, use their money, okay, in a good way. Now, what changes? And it all changes in 1348. And this is where this talk actually sort of intertwines with what's actually happening today, the reason why we're actually all here today. We have this, Yersinia pestis, the plague, and the three types of the bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. And we have this cataclysmic event that basically changes society. And without trying to make any various comments, let's go right to Boccaccio and the introduction of the Decameron. And I was rereading this, and it's amazing. I definitely would say go and read this, because the way he writes the introduction of the Decameron could be explaining what's actually happened today. He's talking about the plague of 1348. And let me just read this to you. How much more can be said of the cruelty of heaven, and possibly in part that of humanity, which between March and July of that year, 1348, because of the ferocity of the pestilence and the fact that many of the sick were poorly cared for, abandoned their hour of need by people frightened for their health, killed off 100,000 human creatures for certain within the walls of the city of Florence. Who, and I continue, before this fatal calamity would have thought there were so many within the city? Oh, how many grand palaces, how many beautiful homes, how many noble dwellings filled with families, with lords and ladies, became completely empty, even of children. Oh, how many famous families, how many vast estates, how many renowned fortunes remained without any rightful successors. As I think over these miseries, sorrow grows inside me. And this is Boccaccio writing in 1348. Read the whole thing, and you're amazing how much it is very much like today. Now, what happens? The population in Florence between 1338 and 1441 drops, they've calculated, between 120,000 down to 37,000. Tremendous drop. The epidemic that kept on coming back created an awareness of mortality that touched every part of life. And in essence, what we have is this concept of the fragility of life. Now how did this impact the family and essentially also art? This catastrophic population, okay, caused by the plague, really put a pressure on cities and families to increase the numbers, to increase the population, to keep the population alive, to fight wars, to pay taxes. So the civic nature of this city-state, like I show in this drawing, put a tremendous emphasis on the family, on procreation, and in essence, on the female in certain cases. Okay, well, in every case. Now, this is where we get down to the microcosm, the importance of the woman's role in society. There was an obligation of women to contribute to the community. The importance of the female role in society through marriage, childbirth, and keeping the home. And what I have on the right-hand side is that painting in the Uffizi, the polaiuolo of this young woman. And this obligation emanates in Renaissance art, in the objects that I'm going to show you. So section 3, let's go back to sort of a microcosmic sort of look at this. We have the importance of the palazzo, the home, so to speak, and this is a Palazzo Davanzati. And first off, where does the word come from? Palazzo, as we all know, comes from Palatine, the Palatine Hill in Rome, where emperors had their huge, lavish residences, where they built them. In fact, the image that I've included is you're looking over the Roman Forum into the Palatine Hill. Huge, huge structures. This basically gets picked up again in this you could say shift of display of wealth in the Renaissance. So what happens? After the plague, we have this shift from this public to a private domain. You could even say it's a transition from a sacred to a secular. There's a change in the way wealth is displayed. You could even say a need to hide the possessions in the private palace instead of this public enjoyment of riches. Okay, they're still worried about their sins and everything, but we have palaces like the Davanzati palace that starts to go up, and others later on. So if you look at the Palazzo Davanzati, actually built by the Davizi family, and I'm sure everyone has walked in there, one of the best museums in Florence. Okay, this gives us a test piece of this shift, and let's go inside, so to speak. If we look at the interior of the Palazzo Davanzati, up in the upper left, we can see the bedroom. Down below, we can see other sort of objects. Or again, at the right, the Sala Madornale. We start to see the need for art for the palace and also the family, because now the family is so incredibly important. They need children. We have to keep this city alive. And this emanates in a mass production of everything. Art related. Now, when we move into the 1400s, this is the true era of the Renaissance palazzo in the middle of the 15th century. Again, fortunes begin to come back. Okay, wealthy families begin to amass, again, large amounts of wealth, and they need to build their stately residences of considerable size. There's a new building craze, so to speak, in the middle of the century, from around 1450 onward. And we know at least 30 types of these palazzi were actually built. In fact, if you read Luca Landucci, and I will definitely recommend everyone to read Luca Landucci, the Florentine diary, who's an apothecary that writes what happens in Florence from, I think, 1451 to about 1519. he states that the people of that time, okay, were building to such an extent there was a lack of craftsmen and material. It's a brilliant book, but the best book on the Renaissance because it gives you the nitty-gritty. It's saying that everyone is building. Now, if you look at palace structures, but I don't want to spend too much time on this, there's usually 3 stories, clearly divided up from one another, architectural orders, impressive facades, rusticated masonry. They're still defensive. Okay, basically they're fortified castles in certain cases. They're elegant, classical, inner courtyards, colonnades in certain cases. Let me go ahead. And the way it worked, and I'm sure anyone who's walked into these palaces, down below you have these open spaces. Those were the botteghe. They actually rented them out in order to get money back. The family lived in the 2nd floor, the piano nobile. And above them, that's where the servant quarters actually that were, in the open loggia. And they were capped with these cornices. They had a stone bench. It was a Roman tradition. This was the domus. And we had the dominus, in other words, the main guy, okay, the head of the family. So what are some of the examples? If you walk around Florence in Via della Vigna Nuova, Palazzo Rucellai by Leon Battista Alberti in the 1400s, okay, this facade, okay, revolutionary, one of the most important ones. And then we have probably the granddaddy of them all, and that's the Palazzo Medici di Cardi, associated with the guy at right, Cosimo de' Medici. And this is where the palace starts to take on the concept of status, okay, even more so. Now, anyone who's ever walked down the Duomo and come across the Palazzo Medici di Cardi realizes that this dominates, okay, the whole street, okay? And basically it had to. The Medici were basically the unsung rulers, okay? They were the rulers of Florence. And if you look at this Medici palace, you can see rusticated architecture as it goes up 3 stories, huge cornice, benches down below. This sort of rings of absolute power. But what it does is it generates a whole series of art. And we have the concept of the art for the palace. And some of the most important works of Renaissance art ever produced, like Donatello's David, Bronze David, okay, was produced for this palace, this first Renaissance nude. And let me just go ahead. And what I've done is a photo montage. This is how Dave really looked. This is how Donatello actually made him. He had gold hair on. He had gold touches. And what I've tried to do is sort of shrink him down and put him in this, at left, the palazzo, the courtyard. It was basically a private dwelling, but he could be seen through in certain cases, some of these open doors. And this is what it's all about. It's art. Some of the most important pieces of Renaissance art were done for the palace. The David is the bedrock, okay, of the nude in Renaissance sculpture. But there was also art for the palace as the painting in the Medici chapel. And we have our own private chapel. And I'll just give you one. I wish I could spend more time on this, but we have this image, the beginning of the procession of the Magi. And we have Benozzo Gozzoli, who's doing frescoes with this egg tempera touch-ups. And the cluster of horses at left, you can see the guy on the horseback dressed in black is Cosimo. And yes, it's propaganda for the family. It's decorative. Okay, it shows faith and everything. But it's one of the most important frescoes done for the home itself. Now, that's the general sort of aspect of this. Let's go to section 4 and the stages of life and art. Let's bring it down to 3 events: marriage, childbirth, and death. And what I have is I have images. That left, I have the Marriage of the Virgin by Domenico Ghirlandaio, another detail of a Ghirlandaio, a wet nurse, and then at right the Sassetti Chapel. And thank God for Domenico Ghirlandaio, who records all of this in the 1400s, basically records life of the Renaissance. And we have to go back to what Boccaccio said. And let me just reiterate this. Oh, how many grand palaces, how many beautiful homes, how many noble dwellings filled with families and lords and ladies became completely emptied, even of children. And this brings us right to the families that lived in these large palaces. And we have to deal with the concept of the Renaissance woman. Now, the major events in the life of the Renaissance woman, you can sort of break it down. So you have the physical appearance, okay, the family status, where they're from, dowry, marriage, childbirth, the survival of childbirth, and then managing of the family itself. And you have this image, okay, of this quintessential Renaissance female, okay, these wedding portraits. Now, a parenthetical discourse, and I wish I could spend more time on this if we're talking about just a purely physical, is one writer of the Renaissance, Franco Sacchetti, about the physical appearance of these Renaissance women, states that, quote, the woman in certain cases must be a better painter than Giotto himself, in the sense that if you look at these images, Renaissance beauty sort of practices were lead white base on your face and mercuric sulfide rouge, lapis lazuli on your eyes, plucking your eyebrows, bleaching your hair, plucking your eyebrow. And if you notice these portraits that I'll get into in a second, they're filled with pearls and very lavish gowns, which were the image of the Renaissance woman. So this is the physical aspect, the nature of it. Okay. And if you look at the general concept of women in the Renaissance, they had to be lovely, graceful, charming. They also had to be physically mature enough to undergo childbirth, because the youthful woman was vital for the producing the male heir for the family. And we get back to the concept of those palaces emptied even of children. And then they also had to keep the home. Now, what does that mean? And let me just digress for just a second. Leon Battista Alberti writes in his Della Famiglia, another amazing book on the Renaissance. And he states this about women in the home: they should know how to sew and take care of the house. A good wife gets up early in the morning, watches over the work of the servants, prepares the bread, mends the sheets, prepares lunch, serves her husband with joy. She should never dare to ask him how he will spend the day or how to spend money, nor get involved in his affairs or read his personal documents. Now, this is a very cold sort of view in certain cases, maybe not for all of the aristocratic women, but it was in the view of this of the duties in certain cases. And that's Alberti when he's talking in an earlier time period. If you're talking about the females, however, it also came down to an economic, okay, the money, the goods, the estate that the wife brings to the husband at marriage, and because she represented her father's wealth, and this attracted, okay, another wealthy family, in other words, to make this union. And this we come to marriage. And we have this image of Ghirlandaio, of the marriage of the Virgin. And this is what we have to get into. Now, for the family, for any family, marriage was a defining moment. And there's a successful match, huge financial outlay. We have aristocrats in search of rich merchants and vice versa for their daughters. That is in certain cases to replenish their pockets. So it was this union. You have an image on the right of this manuscript of this Renaissance marriage. Marriage was still a sacrament in the eyes of the church, but a valid matrimony was not a church ceremony. It was actually a private a ritual of dowry exchanges and ring giving outside the church, and they had their mass. Now, what was interesting, and this actually affects some of the art that actually gets made, is that we have these grooms, the males that are in certain cases 30 and even older, entering into, you can call it quasi-parental relationships with teenage brides. So it was extremely interesting. There was sometimes upwards of a 20-year difference in certain cases, which meant that in certain cases, if you look at the social and economic factors, it really wasn't an emotional union. It was a social and economic connection. It was a secular agreement. And what I've included off to the right is actually an image of a Ghirlandaio fresco in the Chapel of the Buonomini, right in the center of the heart of Florence. And if you look at this, if you can actually see it, these wonderful frescoes of the Buonomini and the various things that they did. We have a Renaissance wedding. We have the groom at left, the bride at right. He's putting the ring on her finger. And I don't know if you can see the individual behind the groom is actually putting money into the outstretched hands of the groom, sort of paying him. Okay, and then we have at left one of the Buonomini who's actually writing things down, writing out the contract. At left, you can also see the church that they'll probably go in and have that first mass together. And this gives a very almost cold view of things. Now, for marriage, what was the art that was produced? And we're talking about sort of the aristocrats. We had these that were produced, cassoni, or the chests. And again, this is a topic in itself. So I'm trying to put this into what were the natural sort of stages of art produced in the union of these two families. Wedding chests, the cassoni. Now, where are these in Florence? At left, if you go into the Bargello, into the big Donatello room, right underneath the St. George, you have some of the best examples of cassone that I've ever seen. You know, I have my studio in San Frediano, and I see a lot of woodworkers who have to restore these, and some of them are absolutely exquisite in private collections, but the Bargello has some of the best examples I've seen of painted ones. If you go into the Bardini, off to the right, you can have that one room, and you can see them in the back of various types, and there's actually sort of a codification of these things. So if you want to know where to go, you go to the Bargello or the Bardini, and there's dozens of these. But what were they? These chests were essentially presented to from the parents to the daughter. Excuse me. In other words, they were made on commission by the spouse, but they're presented to, in certain cases, it depended on the situation. They were painted inside and out. They were stucco. They were covered with gold. These were luxury objects. Now, these were made to contain clothing, cloth, even jewelry. Even my mother actually had a hope chest. So the tradition still is retained in certain cases. It was designed to impress the spouse's future family and also the servants. And the chests were given a privileged position in the bedroom. Okay, so in certain cases, some people even think that it was a means of, if they had to leave the palace quickly, they could throw all their valuables in there and then use them even as beds or couches as they were running away. In certain cases, they're on their carts as well. So these were highly decorated objects. This was an integral part of the marriage rituals of the Florentine elite during the 15th century. It did happen up in other cities, and it really was representative of the family status. I have one up to the right to show you just how decorative they are. Now, in certain cases, these cassones involved a greater financial outlay than many of the paintings that we value today. So something like, if you walk into the Uffizi, you have to realize that these cassones were actually cost more than some of the paintings that we call masterpieces, which is sort of interesting when you look at this. Now, these were painted, and what's interesting is that the painting, the imagery, was actually directed towards, obviously, the female in the marriage. Now, they were symbols of good luck, of fertility, the continuity of the family line. There were allegorical, historical subjects, themes related to the ideals of Renaissance marriage and virtues. And in essence, they were to instruct the young, usually teenage brides, okay, in marital conduct. Now, if you look at these, and again, I wish I had more time, they're very, very sort of classical. Okay, they're virtues of the decorations, even the carving is amazing. They're usually the coats of arms of various families. Like I said, gold leaf. But when you open them up, this is when it starts to get interesting. In certain cases, these are interior of the upper lid, the interior of the upper lid, we have these reclining female nudes or male and female nudes. Which is extremely interesting, almost lascivious in certain cases. This would only be seen if you opened it up. And here's another example of a cassone that on the outside it has all these very allegorical, very sort of a Renaissance, humanistic sort of themes. But when you open it up, it starts to get into the sort of intricacies of the marriage itself. And what's interesting is that if you can tie this into the art that we know and love about Botticelli's Primavera, painted for Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de' Medici and Semiramide da Piano, so one of the Medici line. You have the spring with all the three graces and fertility and flowers. And when you look at this with the birth of Venus, okay, the first female nude of the Renaissance, the Zephyr that's blowing her in. And again, this is a whole talk on itself. So we have fertility, we have love, Venus, and then we have Pallas and Centaur, okay, which is seen, these were all seen together, which this Pallas, this female goddess, is sort of calming the lustful appetites of this centaur and leading him away from this serene lake, to keep this marital sort of a bliss going. If you try and translate this into, well, in a museum setting, you get these various, paintings. But what I think is that these are, and this is in the Uffizi, these are exactly what cassones were. Now, this is sort of, again, my photo montage. In the front, we have fertility, okay, the primavera, but as you open it up, you have the Venus. Now, again, I've elongated these things, and Botticelli did not intend these to go on cassones, obviously, but the mechanism is there. He just made it into his own. He did something larger, put them on the wall, whereas the theme, the concept of the female, okay, marriage and fertility, and even the lascivious aspect of it, okay, is quite strong and done so in a painting that is actually a masterpiece. From the Cassoni, then we get something a little more personal, wedding portraits. And again, I go back to the Pollaiolo that's in the Uffizi. And we have to deal with these because there's a number of them. Now, if you look at the inner state of let's say the Renaissance woman, okay, and it's interesting how the study of this art is really a study of the Renaissance woman. We have these females like Maddalena Strozzi by Raphael, right? The daughter of the Strozzi family had to fulfill these parental desires for successful marriage and the creation of a family. Remember, the Strozzi are trying to reestablish themselves in the city. In certain cases, the nervousness was the unfamiliarity of knowing their husband. They didn't know their husband. The marriage, the consummation of the marriage. In certain cases, they were given upwards of 6 months to know them. Okay, the anxiety of conception, the fear of pregnancy, even childbirth, and also the high mortality rate of mother and child. So these are the realities, okay, of this, and this worked into the art as well. Now, if you look at these portraits, there's about 40 of these painted portraits that survive. And all of them follow this format of elaborate costumes, pearls, jeweled pearls, because that was a symbol of essentially Venus, okay, fertility. Even today in Italy, when a female gives birth, is that the husband should give her a string of pearls as well. And the costumes, the dresses actually showed a lot about their social status, then in certain cases even about the sitters themselves. Many are actually unidentified. But it was this beautiful object of this Renaissance woman. But behind them, there's an immense amount of stress. And there's only one that I know of actually that they're smiling in certain cases. Now, we could go through all 40 of them, but you can start to see the Pollaiolo and other ones, they start to repeat, okay? The very neutral background, very expensive garb, okay, made up, okay, usually blonde hair because they bleach their hair. But if you can go to one that I think everyone knows, okay, the Mona Lisa of around 1503, Lisa di Antonio Maria Gherardesca, who's wife of Francesco, okay, Mona being the term of respect, my lady, La Gioconda. This is this portrait of this woman, okay, you could say wedding portrait in certain cases. Leonardo puts this amazing background behind her. She might be a little smiley, but you have to imagine that behind this, okay, there was tremendous amount of social pressure in certain cases. Okay, and the art, okay, has to sort of record it and also in certain cases glorify, okay, as well. Now, another great example of these portraits made for the wedding was Raphael, the Agnolo Doni and Maddalena Strozzi. Agnolo Doni, this was his second wife. Maddalena Strozzi, I believe, was around 16. She's decked out. This is taken obviously from the Mona Lisa, from Leonardo, and Raphael was taking everything from Leonardo. They had met by this time in Florence in the early 1500s. Leonardo becomes sort of like his artistic godfather in certain cases, and she's decked out with rings and pearls and rubies. Okay, she doesn't look very happy, and you can probably imagine why. So again, one of the most famous portraits that we have in the Uffizi are associated with this cultural sort of phenomenon. And then we also have sculpted busts on the right, the Verrocchio. And these are interesting because we actually have an idea of where these were actually placed in the home. And if you go to look at this slide, I don't know if you can see it at the left, you can actually see this female portrait right above this one door. The one in the image in the center is actually in the home itself, and you can see a female portrait like the one at right, that was actually placed above, and this was this as you're going into the bedroom, you can actually see it. So these were actually where they were placed, and it basically keeps the same sort of idea as the painted portrait. But if we can draw a very simple conclusion from all of this, the portraits of the woman, okay, in certain cases, encouraged her to fulfill the role in marriage as prescribed to her by society. So the art was actually this very subtle, I can just say it, I don't want to say propaganda, but celebration of her. And we have Raphael, we have Verrocchio, we have Leonardo. All of these great artists work within this mechanism. That was their bread and butter, which is extremely interesting when you think about it. These just weren't works of art just to do and then say I did a painting of a woman. No, they had a function. Now, art and childbirth. You go from marriage and then you're expected to give birth, and we have this image of Ghirlandaio, the birth of St. John the Baptist, this Renaissance interior. So what I'm going to be referring to, you have to understand that the birth of children in this time period happened in an environment like this. This gives us one of the best images that we have of Elizabeth laid out in state into the wet nurse, these women coming in, sort of paying homage to this new birth, a celebration. And this really is a celebration. Any child that survived was a means of, or a great sort of excuse to celebrate. Now, marriage and childbirth. The couples that were formed in the marriage were expected to create a family. That was the fruition of a successful marriage. Now, pregnancy, and the delivery thereof, was to follow marriage. You have to imagine the anxiety of conception, number one. The fear of childbirth. And also this high mortality rate of mother and child. And this is this image of this wet nurse. Let's just get into this. Now, mortality rate. This was a reality of the Renaissance. Why was mortality rate so high? We had poor health, unsanitary conditions in certain cases, lack of contraceptives. We also had the phenomenon of wet nurses. There was these young girls that were given the newborn to nurse. And in certain cases, this decreased the time between pregnancies. So a woman on the average gave birth like almost every 20 months. And the problem is that 1 in 10 Florentine women died in childbirth. And in certain cases, many babies died before reaching the first birthday. Now, what I did is I put at left, I have Battista Sforza. This is the wife of Federico Montefeltro. This is Medici. If I'm not mistaken, she dies at 27 after 9 children. So it wasn't just the first one you could die after, but even after other ones as well. So with this in mind, you have to imagine that, and this must have been an amazing or extremely traumatic, that Florentine women often made out their wills in the late stages of pregnancy. And this was the reality of it. Now, it's easy to talk about this, but what was the reality of it? And let me read this to you. So, and this is a letter by Giovanni Tornabuoni to his cousin Lorenzo the Magnificent on the 23rd of September, 1477. He says, "My most dear Lorenzo, I'm so oppressed by grief and pain for the most bitter unforeseen accident of the death of my most sweet wife, that I myself, do not know where I am. As you will have heard yesterday, as pleased God, at the 22nd hour she passed away from this life in childbirth, and the infant which was extracted from the body dead, which was to me a double means of grief still. I am certain that you have to use your mercy and compassion on me, and excuse me if I do not write you at length." So this was the reality of it. And he's writing. Giovanni Tornabuoni, the Medici bankers, writing to his cousin, "My wife just passed away, and also the child. She'd already given birth to 2 children, so this was her third." Now I'm going to go into this later in the death aspect, but this was the reality of it. So how did this reflect itself in art? And we have this image of the Madonna. Let's get into some of the sacred. We have to go to this one individual named Giovanni Dominici. And he writes this treatise on the role of the family governance. And he's advocating art in service of religion, but also art in the home to educate children, but also to reassure the women. And we have at left, we have these wonderful images of Luca della Robbia, this little Madonna, with this a child. And what we're seeing is this young girl with this child, and these were to be used in the home. What does he write? And this is what he writes on art. Is that the first rule is to have paintings in the house of holy little boys or young virgins, in which your child, when still in swaddling, may see himself reflected with actions and things attractive to infancy. And as I say of paintings, so I say of sculptures. The Virgin Mary is good with the child in her arms and the little bird or pomegranate in its fist. So we have it right, another Luca della Robbia. He says that the child may see himself reflected in the actions, but in certain cases, it's actually the female that might see herself reflected in these actions. And what do I mean by this? And let me go to this. This is the interior of the Medici Palace. I'm sure everyone, as you exit out from the Benozzo Gozzoli frescoes, you're confronted with this bedroom. It's a little bit contrived, but it gives us a good example. We have the bedroom. Now, it's probably a little different. And usually, in certain cases, above, there was an image of the Madonna, or either above the bed or in some cases on the other side, on the opposite side. Some art historians have said that since these young girls, in the consummation of their marriage, were deathly afraid of everything, that this image of the Madonna, this young girl, and this the baby as well, was the point of reference. How do you say it? A soothing sort of face, or this reassuring that sort of image that things are going to go okay, that everything will go okay. Now, whether they believed or not, but it was this image of a young girl who had already given birth and survived in certain cases. Now, women and childbirth. The women who survived the ideal of childbirth might go on to produce a dozen children, and these births were celebrated, and this generated a whole art form, which I think should be sort of like brought back, and that's the desco da parto, the birth salver, or the tray of childbirth. Now, these at right, you can actually see that's the tray that was for Lorenzo the Magnificent. These were circular or sometimes 12-sided painted wooden trays to present small gifts, sweetmeats, and wine to the mother after childbirth. They were highly decorated with these various scenes on other sides, a coat of arms on the other side in certain cases, okay? And essentially, they were displayed in the bedchamber or the apartments. And they were basically made to announce to the viewer that the woman had fulfilled her duty to the city. In other words, they were sort of like a purple heart, okay, that they were put there. The mature male and the obedient sort of fertile mother who has given birth. Now, I include the ghirlandaio, but if you look at this very closely, off to the left, you see this gold sort of tray, a birth salver. And then off to the right, you can actually see a female walking in with the birth salver on her head with what they probably produced and gave to the woman. Now, these trays, okay, if you look at them, in certain cases were talismanic, sort of to keep away all the bad things that could happen. And if anyone's ever walked through the Palazzo Davanzati, we have a great birth salver by the Scheggia, Civettino. At left, we have this image of these boys that are playing. At right, we have these two little cherubs that are sort of playing this weird game. Okay, I'm not going to really go into that, but it's sort of to keep the fertile thing going. And on either side, there were the two images of the two families. And these were presented to the woman. They were hung, okay, presented in the bedroom, kept there. Now, I also, like I said before, we have this of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This is the Desco da Parto Lorenzo the Magnificent, where on one side you have the triumph of fame. He was born on the 1st of January, 1449. And even then they knew he was being groomed by Cosimo because Piero, his dad really wasn't sort of all there. And what we have on the back side, we have the Medici and the Tornabuoni coat of arms. Now this was given to Lucrezia Tornabuoni, okay, upon the birth of Lorenzo, and we still have this. So these are the types of things that were given to celebrate birth, okay, to sort of a medal, okay, of honor in certain cases. Now, what type of conclusions can we make from this? You can say that in the wake of the catastrophic population decline, okay, that was still happening by this time period, caused by the plague and other things, it was important to celebrate birth in children. Every birth was important, okay? Was important not just for the family, but for the city itself, okay? And it generated, again, this art, okay, this very, very personal art, which I think is a wonderful tradition. I always wanted to see if I could get it actually going again in certain cases. Now, if we can pull it into a larger realm of Renaissance art, I always thought that if you go into the Uffizi, and now they've done it really well, they put the two Raphael portraits of Agnolo Doni and Maddalena Strozzi right next to the Doni Tondo. And what's interesting is that Doni Tondo, what I think, is like one huge desco da parto. It's one big, huge, it's just placed on the wall. And Michelangelo just did it okay, on a large scale. Now, why do I say this? If you know the story behind this Maddalena Strozzi, she gives birth to 4 children, all named John, that all pass away at a very young age. She then gives birth to a 5th child, Maria, who survives. And this, what I think, is why Agnolo Doni asked Michelangelo, paint me, okay, a huge painting, a desco da parto, but to really celebrate this. And notice that there are 5 heads in the frame. Also, the references to the Strozzi and other the family things with the crescents and stuff. In the painting itself, you have the Madonna, the Holy Family, and these 5 U's in the back. And there's these very interesting references to taking off these darkened cloaks of sin and putting on these white cloaks of virtue. And then we have the little John the Baptist down below at right, who's on the other side. Okay, remember the 4 children named John never made it into life. Okay, as well, looking into Maria as well. So if you want to pull it in, okay, to the 1500s, okay, I think that the Doni Tondo, this is just my personal opinion, could be sort of like a large desco da parto done by Michelangelo. Let's go into art and death. And I promise you this will have a happy ending afterwards, but let's get into this. And we have to get into, I think, one of the most amazing works of art in relation to death in the Renaissance. And that's the relief of Francesca Pitti Tonaboni. And let's go into this. Remember, I read this letter to you, Giovanni Tonaboni to his cousin Lorenzo, and he says, as you will have heard yesterday, it's pleased God in the 22nd hour, okay, passed away from this life, okay, my wife, childless and the infant was extracted from the body dead, and it was to me a double grief still. It's interesting that he probably refers to some sort of a cesarean. And this is Giovanni Tonaboni at left, okay. Now, Giovanni Tonaboni, as I didn't mention, was the head banker of the Medici Bank in Rome. And what he does is that he commissions probably a Verrocchio, a huge tomb that was supposed to go into Santa Maria sopra Minerva. It's since been dispersed. And he has created one of the most poignant, I think, images of death in the Renaissance. It's this relief, this high relief. So let's go into this just a little more. We have the death of Francesca Pitti Tonaboni. Now, what do we see here? And this is worth actually looking at. We have the bed in the center. We have poor Francesca in the center going through this horrific event. We have all of the midwives around her that are already grieving, and she's in her last moments of life. And it really shows what must have happened in the Renaissance at this time period. Okay, and if you go even further and look at it even still, you can see that her hair is all scraggly. Okay, her dress is falling down, and this is at the moment that this woman is her last moments on earth. And as a work of art, it actually takes this classical, sort of references to it, sort of turns it into extremely poignant. In fact, it's very unlike anything you're going to see. This is actually in the Bargello as well. But that's not the half of it. We have the other half, and that's the presentation of the deceased child to Giovanni Tonaboni. And here we have Giovanni. He's the person that left. You can see he has the largest head, as the midwife is presenting his deceased little child, which is absolutely excruciatingly true to life. Now, it's interesting how the one is actually, the female part is, they're weeping, and he's a little more stoic. But if you know by the letter that I read you, he was beyond himself with grief. And if you look at this, if you look at Francesca itself, which I think is extremely amazing, this woman is sort of idealizing the essence of what I've been talking about. It compels everyone to sympathize through the image of Francesca. She's exhausted. She's in her last moments. She's calm. She's courageous. She's dignified. This heroic sacrifice, okay, that she's given as well, and it really is a heroic sacrifice. Okay, this truthful representation by Verrocchio that Giovanni wanted commemorated, validated, even highlighted the risks that women undertook to provide male heirs for their husbands and for the Republic. And this, I think, is one of the most poignant sort of images in all of Renaissance art to this. Very, very poignant. Okay, very unlike anything else. Now, besides this personal sort of tragedy of the Tornabuoni, let's start the cycle again. And the next thing I'm going to show you is a family chapel, the Sassetti, which does deal with death, but also deals with life again. And I think I'll leave everyone with more sort of an upbeat type of thing. We have to deal with family chapels, okay, and I'll be concluding with this. If you go into the Church of Santa Trinita, via Tornabuoni, and walk in there, this is an amazing church, okay? You go all the way down the aisle and off to the right-hand side, the second chapel on the right. You have what I think is one of the most brilliantly painted family chapels in Florence by Domenico Ghirlandaio, painted around 1480, okay, early 1480, 1485. And that's the chapel at right, the Sassetti Chapel. Now, what is this? What is this? It's about death and life. And I think this is interesting because every family chapel that I showed you, the BARDI, PERUZZI, has the concept of death and the family are buried there, yes. But this chapel is extremely interesting because I think it celebrates both death and life itself. Now, the chapel was purchased by Francesco Sassetti. Again, Francesco Sassetti was another Medici banker. He was in Lyon. And it's interesting how most of the art that I've shown you has revolved around the Medici Bank. And we're talking about the cream of the crop, so to speak. He was grooming his son Theodore to take over his banking in Lyon when his son Theodore dies in May of 1479. Now, this was a tremendous blow to him. He was actually trying to come back into Florence because he saw the writing was already on the wall because he knew that Lorenzo wasn't a banker. But the chroniclers report and agree that the murals, or the frescoes, I should say, painted by Ghirlandaio, were painted in fulfillment of a vow. In other words, the chapel bore the double dedication to his dead son, yes, but also to his new son, because what happens? Francesco gives birth to another son that he names Theodore. And he also had five daughters as well. But he has this new son, and he is so sort of thankful for this, okay? He's grieving his dead son, but he's thanking God for his new son, that the chapel bears this double dedication to St. Francis and to the Nativity. Now, why Francis? Because his name is Francis, Francesco, okay? And the subjects are the life of St. Francis and the resuscitation of the Roman notary's son. This is extremely interesting. Now, if you are looking in the chapel, you have to put the coin in for the light. If you look at, there's this wonderful a painting of Ghirlandaio in Tempera Grazia of the Nativity, and we have Nera Corsi, his wife, and Francesco down below. Those are the two donor portraits. Above it, you can see this scene, and it's actually set right in front of the church, okay, Santa Trinita in Via Tornabuoni, at like there's a Palazzo Spina where Ferragamo is. And basically it tells the story of this little boy, this happens in Rome, who falls out of the window, and essentially he's laid out, and Francis appears and he resuscitates him. And this is what Francesco Sassetti, this is why he chose this. And at left you have the Sassetti females, and at right you have some of the males as well. But the one scene I think that sort of puts all this together is this, and this is the codification of the rule of St. Francis. This is at left, and I'm sure everyone who's seen this has been here. If you look through the arches, you can actually see Piazza della Signoria, that's the Loggia dei Lanzi. At left, you have the Palazzo Vecchio, the UFFIZI is in there yet. But off to the right, there's a group of four, which I've tried to enlarge, and the guy with the dark hair is actually Lorenzo de' Medici. The guy in red to his right is actually Francesco Sassetti, and then there's his new little son, Theodore, okay? And this is what it's all about. So it's actually celebrating that, yes, his old son, the old son, I should say, his previous son, Theodore, had died, but we have this new son, this new sort of, how do you say, a new life. It's resuscitation, so to speak. And thus we start, okay, the cycle again. So what type of conclusions can we make about this? And I've sort of brought it down to three. In many ways, there are many ways to interpret Renaissance art, and they're all valid, culturally, economically, stylistically. You can look at everything. But what I wanted to do, I tried to do, is contextualize Renaissance art first as an emanation of the cycle of life. with subsequent divisions into various interpretations. Okay, so first I look at it, being an artist itself, is that it's the person who wants the art. It's not art history that imposes the artist to do something to further art history. What I would try to sort of not advise, but just suggest is to try to get inside the works of art, to fully understand the personal and the sometimes extremely poignant meaning that's lost to history. And it really starts to come alive and even makes them more masterful in itself. Thank you for staying with me.
Thank you very much, Alan, on behalf of everyone.
Your attention.
Alan, if I can ask you to unshare your screen, then everyone will pop up on this. So hit the green button. Yeah.
Okay.
And then we'll take some questions and comments if you want to do that, everybody. But before that, I just want to say a couple of notices. Next week, same time, we're delighted to have Helen Farrell, who's the editor-in-chief of the Florentine magazine, and she's going to give a talk about what's going on in Florence right now, Florence under lockdown, and what it means for the city, and some of the thinking that's emerging as to what will happen next. So at the same time next week, Wednesday, 6 o'clock, all the details in the weekly What's On Monday. I'd also like just to highlight that we are, in response to some requests coming out of this series, we are exploring the idea of starting a weekly seminar, 5 sessions, taught to begin with by Jeremy Boudreau, looking at particular themes, 5 one-hour sessions Monday through Friday. And to prepare for that, to develop the product correctly, we're putting out a survey, which you're all invited to respond to if you'd be interested in that. Again, you'll find that on the website, and we'll put it out again on the What's On Monday. And last but not least, thank you all very much to those people who've been donating very generously to support this series. And indeed to support Il Cuore di Firenze, the charity which is supporting the hospitals here in Florence. The response from our community to this appeal has been extremely generous, and I just would urge you to keep giving, because we have a lot of problems in Florence. People are still dying. So thanks all for attending. And Alan, you haven't managed to get rid of your screen.
Okay, well, is it the new share or the large green button?
I think I can do it.
Okay.
No, I can't. It's the green button, the green arrow at the bottom.
Okay.
Do you just stop?
I have mine that's coming out. Let's see, Alan.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, that's got me.
Okay.
Instead of you. I'll stop the share.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. Yay. Okay, so anybody who would like to ask Alan a question or make a comment related to the talk, please feel free to unmute yourself. But if you're not talking, please keep mute on, otherwise it becomes chaos. So any thoughts from anybody?
It was fabulous. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you.
The new way to look at art. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was interesting, but no, thanks for staying with me. It was thank you. Now you can drink your wine. Now you can drink your wine.
Very, very interesting, Alan. Thank you very much.
Mark, you're very welcome.
I wonder about your interesting idea about the Dono Tondo being a desk da parto. Is that your own idea, or is that?
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, I haven't seen it written anywhere. I've never written it down in the article, but it just seemed so logical, and that it was sort of like an innovation, which I think was sort of it was my idea. I'm not, again, it's unprovable, but I thought it was something I'd like to shoot out. You guys are the first to hear it, actually.
Could I possibly ask a question? Sorry. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. I'm actually an art history teacher, and I've taught students to watch this, and it's been so good, and donate as well, but it's been really wonderful. I just wanted to ask about the cassones. You said it was from the parents to the bride. Was it from the bride's parents or from the groom's parents?
Okay, in going into this, it gets a little sticky. It usually is the bride's parents that give it to the bride, who then essentially present it to the husband. Now, what's interesting is that I'm sure you've seen like wedding processions. If you go like in Siena, you have the allegory of good government, the wedding procession as that bride is riding through. What I've read is that in certain cases, these were actually put on a cart and processed through the streets. Because remember, the bride always went to go live in the groom's home. So it was something that the bride's family gave her, so as to show off all the wealth, and actually sort of paraded through the streets. So yeah, it goes back and forth, but essentially it was the bride's family trying to show off their wealth in certain cases, even though the imagery was something that the groom was trying to impose on her, and that's where it starts to intertwine and get a little sticky in certain cases. It's a good question, though. It's a good question.
Thank you. Cheers.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.
Thanks, Dr. Allen.
Oh, hey. Okay. You're very welcome.
Lizzie, I just point out that if your students didn't see it live, the session has been recorded and will be put up on YouTube. You can find the link on our website, www.britishinstitute.it, under cultural program, virtual cultural program. And we'll also put the link to the lecture in the What's On message on Monday morning. And if you're not on that distribution list, Lizzie, send us an email and we'll put you on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. Thanks everyone for participating. This was a great experience. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
very
you.
well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a
Done.
pleasure.
Very well.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for
It's
having
really
me.
great.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Great
Sweet.
Thank you.
for
Have a
future
great
readings.
evening. Have a great evening.
you.
Simon, thank you for everything. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan. That was fantastic. We'll be in touch, man.
Okay.
Cheers.
Have a good one. Bye-bye. Bye to everyone. Bye to everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.